This is SPE Talks Tech with Trent Jacobs
and Steve Rassenfoss, and together we cover emerging technology for the Journal of Petroleum Technology.
Hey everyone, welcome to the SPE podcast. It's officially fall here in the Northern Hemisphere, so Steve, happy fall, and to all our listeners in the Southern Hemisphere, happy spring.
Right, and none of us flooded, so we're at work and we're happy to talk about technology.
Yeah. In case you're not familiar with the weather habits of Houston, it's kind of become monsoon season, and we're all shaking off a little bit of wet weather and ready to get into some hardcore technology stuff with oil and gas. Hey there, listener. Would you like to have all things SPE delivered wherever you go instantly? Well, we got you covered. SPE now has an app. You get access to One Petro, all the full SPE event calendar. I've got the app on my phone. The home screen is really easy to access. It's easy to use. It's available in both the App Store and Google Play. Just search SPE International and download that thing today. So, Steve, we got a few different topics today. We were going to look at some real-time fracturing, what that means for the shale sector. We're going to talk about some pressure monitoring, some developments in the reservoir diagnostic space. And then one of the things we wanted to wrap up with was sort of a higher level look at so-called cube drilling out in the Permian, where that is today, where it's going.
And so what do you want to start, Trent?
Well, we're going to look at our first topic was, real-time fracturing or real-time fracking and what that is. If in case you're not in the know here, the shale sector in the United States and Canada as well is talking about moving away from so-called cookie cutter fracs. These are the fracturing designs that if you have 25 stages, maybe 50 stages in a well, you essentially do every one of them the same, and you limit the changes in subsequent wells as well. So people are looking at an alternative, which would be more custom stage designs. You may use a different rate to pump it in. You may use different kinds of fluids or volumes of fluids and volumes of sand. So this is kind of starting a big debate in the shale sector, in the completions arena, about how much customization can the sector really do practically.
Well, doesn't it? I mean, obviously, the one thing that everyone says is this rock changes a lot, unpredictably. Wells don't produce evenly. Why not? Why not? Why hasn't this been done?
Essentially, it hasn't been done because the data to get that rock heterogeneity well described hasn't been there on every well. And so people have gotten lots of that information from so-called science wells, but not at a large scale. And then the second big factor is the industry has really been working for the last decade to make the surface operations as efficient as possible. And if you start, introducing unpredictable changes downhole, you also introduce them up on the surface, and you may lose those efficiencies. So it's been from an operational angle and a data angle that is the reason why people really haven't moved to customizing frac stages sooner.
And is there any company that's even doing it yet, or close?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at across the shale production or the shale producer spectrum, you'll find that there are private equity-backed smaller players considered the most nimble in the business who have gone out of their way to customize or tailor a lot of their frac designs, but that's not being done at scale. Then you have larger operators, large independents, some of the majors, looking at this from a pilot perspective. So they're testing out customized designs, and they really want to see if the return can be achieved at scale. So on the one hand, you have these guys who are smaller and can afford to do this. At the other end, when you're fracking 300 wells a year, it becomes a bigger challenge to say I'm going to customize each frac design.
So were you talking customizing from well to well? I mean, years ago, I remember doing a story about fiber optic, and I said, well, if you observe something that was clearly a problem, could you fix it on the next stage? Could you adjust as you went? And they said, oh, no, that's absolutely impossible. The logistics are just insane on that.
Yeah, so the logistics is one thing, but like I said, going back to the subsurface data acquisition, that's becoming much more possible today to get that information out of the well, close to real time or in real time, and actually analyze it and make a decision on the next stage. So that's happening, but the cultural changes, the change management issues, those have not been worked out. who has the authority to implement the change. Usually the field does not have that authority. And in a lot of cases, this data is going to be processed in the field. And so a lot of the operators are working on communication protocols to try to fix this change management issue. Because simply put, like you said, they've never had to make changes. Completion crews will tell you our job is to put sand away. Increasingly, though, now it's going to be to increase the net present value of that well. And that's going to happen on a stage-by-stage basis. We're talking about using different technologies. Digital pressure sensors, we both have picked up on this rising trend. It's not a new technology, but it's become increasingly popular. We're also seeing wireline deployed fiber optics become popular, and even distributed electromagnetic fields. And all of this, the data that's going to come from these technologies is going to feed the platforms that are being rolled out right now. We were both at ERTech, the Unconventional Resources Technology Conference in Denver. And on the show floor, at least half a dozen companies were coming out with completions, data, platforms, similar to what we saw in real-time drilling.
And you mentioned the pressure monitoring, but what are some other couple of those that look like they could be, that the operators are saying are useful?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at it from a cost basis and scalability basis, then you look at pressure sensors as the most scalable. They're the lowest cost of all these diagnostic technologies coming out. So what a lot of operators are doing is they're using some of the fancy stuff, the expensive stuff like microseismic or fiber optics, and they're telling us that they are going to try to correlate those data sets down to pressure sensors, or what the pressure sensors say, and that way they have a very affordable, scalable solution to understand how the rock is talking to them as they frack it.
Are some of these diagnostics so elaborate they're just basically science experiments?
Well, that's what some of these technologies have been cast as for years, right? And so I think we look at microseismic, and everybody knows that's one of the most expensive diagnostics technologies you can use. But one of the companies that's pushing microseismic is also opening itself to this platform world where you can now compare the microseismic data against other diagnostics, fiber, this electromagnetic stuff, or pressure sensors, and try to make it more useful. So I think all the diagnostic vendors have caught on to the fact that shale producers are looking for more data than they ever have. And the big question is how affordable can they make it? And so people are wanting to pair their data sets with other companies' data sets. This is leading many of these companies to form APIs with people who a few years ago could be considered a competitor. But they realize that the operators need multiple data sets, integrated on one screen, and so the vendor market's trying to make that happen.
Well, so now drilling advisory presentations have been spreading those kind of displays. Is there an equivalent of that in the completions realm yet?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's what's happening. So you have companies like Well Data Labs, been around since 2014. They've had a completions platform. Now they have a lot of company. Corva, who you wrote about recently, has become a big name in the drilling advisory, the real-time drilling analytics space. They have 200 apps, 250 rigs they're monitoring here in the U.S. And if you look at Corva's website, you'll see what they offer is a big visualization platform with analytics built into it. That's not available for completions, the completion sector, for years. And as of today, there's about a half a dozen choices for that kind of platform now, including Corva, which has now moved into fracturing.
Of course, now this industry isn't too hot to change unless you can make more money. Is there anybody that's so bold as to say, if we can do this and achieve this, that there's some number they can put on the payoff for it?
Yeah, so this is probably the last point, that I think needs to be made here. The whole idea is that we're going to make more money if we monitor these wells, right? Nobody's diving into this just to learn. And so if you can avoid fracture interference, or frac hits as we call them, you can see that in the data that the signs of a frac hit are happening. Maybe it's going to be production harming based on your history. Now you have the control and the confidence and the data to support your decision in stopping the pumps. Again, this is something, stopping the pumps has only happened really historically on an operational basis. So talking screen outs there. Now we're talking about well interactions. If you can see how the wells are talking to each other and you decide they may be talking too much, all this reservoir diagnostics technology that's happening in real time going into your analytics platform is going to come up with an answer that hopefully says, nope, keep pumping. This is okay. Or it says, you know what, you should stop pumping. And then on the next stage, you should pump at a lower rate and maybe less volume. So start to get prescriptive. That's not quite where I think most of the industry is. That's where everybody wants to go, though. Interesting.
We'll see how long it takes to get there.
Yeah, so let's keep the discussion going on this. This is a big topic that we're going to be reporting on for the foreseeable future. So follow us on social media. If you want to grab our attention, use the hashtag SPE Podcast, and we're going to listen to your comments and perhaps even talk about them. Coming up, a technique being adopted across the Permian that may be falling short of expectations. We're going to take a closer look at cube developments. But first, a reminder about one of SPE's member benefits, SPE Connect, your virtual destination to meet and collaborate. It's a great spot to discuss specific technical challenges and resolutions in the E&P industry. I go here all the time. You should too. All right, so Steve, we just talked about reservoir diagnostics. We got into pressure gauges a little bit, but you have an example, a real-life example of ConocoPhillips and how they're using this technology to learn more about shale development. So what's up with ConocoPhillips?
Well, right, I'm working now on a story that is about the paper they delivered. It's the third in 3 years at ERTech. What's interesting about it is that they had this incredible test site, and the first year they did it, there was just an incredible buzz because, pardon the incredibles, it was just that much. But the buzz was about the fact that they dug up hundreds and hundreds of fractured core, so that people could actually see the fractures they were creating, and they weren't where they were supposed to be. They didn't look like they were supposed to be. A lot of them weren't propped like they were supposed to be. It had a lot of buzz. And this year, it's interesting, it comes back to probably the most old-fashioned, established, been around forever tool for petroleum engineering, which is going back to the pressure gauges. It's really high-end research, and they did a use of it that probably never be replicated. But the message here from the author of the paper, Mark Radaman, or the lead author, I should say, he's a reservoir engineering advisor. He's really kind of famous for leading and explaining this project, was that, it's great to collect the core. We've learned a lot from it. But for engineers, his advice is buy more pressure gauges. It's interesting on a high-end research. You've been writing a lot about pressure gauges this year, right? Have you sworn off them for this year?
Yeah. We were talking earlier before the show, and I was like, I don't think I should write about pressure sensors for the rest of the year. But no, it's been a fascinating thing to look at because I think it's a technology that's been taken for granted here. Now, the pressure gauges that we're talking about today are a little bit more sophisticated than your grandpa's. I mean, they're digital. Some of them can transmit, over the cell networks, and you can get the data in real time. But it is sort of like a base level technology compared to all the stuff we just talked about earlier, fiber optics, microseismic.
Right. I mean, part of it is the problem with fractures, gathering fractures with core, is it's expensive. It's just so expensive. And even when you spend all that money, you still have an awful lot of the reservoir that you don't even see. But the more practical issue is that while you see a fracture, what this industry is based on is what flows through those fractures. And when they went out and measured it, they realized that if you could put a pressure sensor near what was a pretty big producing fracture, that a year and a half later, it could be 1,000 PSI lower pressure than a place 45 feet away. So what you're really seeing is what does production really, really look like? And I think that's been really missing from this industry.
Yeah, and it's pressure management, which is sort of the hallmark of reservoir engineering, right, or the cornerstone of it.
Yeah, that, and their whole focus is on draining things. It used to be that people had this imaginary world where there's this box full of fractures, and they all work, and they're all even. It produces beautifully, and everything they've shown, and this drainage data shows, is that no, really pretty isolated areas end up getting drained. Other areas aren't, and you don't really know the fracture you see 100 feet away, whether that even connects to the reservoir. One they observed was rapidly declining in effectiveness over time. The drainage rate was going way down as measured by the pressure.
But that's one of the most interesting things about these studies with these test site papers. We've seen, anecdotally, when you go to the rooms when they're reading them at the technical conferences or standing room only, in our own reader data, we've seen that these have been very popular. So people really want to know what fractures look like. They also really want to know how far do they go out and what's the length of that conductive fracture. And what Ratterman and other people have been starting to find out is that like, your contribution zone, 60-80% of your oil is going to come from a very, very tight space from the wellbore. So even though the fractures may go very long, your production zone is actually pretty close to the wellbore. Is that right?
Right, and the trick of it is, of course, that whatever they observed is probably going to be different from anything you find somewhere else. But what they see is that this is a chance to calibrate your models, and so this also got into an awful lot of modeling stuff. But I mean, his advice is to be skeptical. I mean, is that before you collect data, before you make any assumptions, because you're liable to be wrong, was his advice of the day. And that I think that makes a whole lot of sense. And I think this is an industry that needs to invest in actually looking at what's going on, and that's a quantity rather than a quality kind of proposition.
Yeah, and the other thing that's interesting about this is, as more people write about this, so we have ConocoPhillips. I've written a few articles about different companies saying almost the exact same thing, which is the pressure gauges are offering a direct look at where oil and gas is flowing out. So this has been a big mystery really for like 15 years in the shale sector. But with the simple pressure gauge, whether it's downhole or on the surface, you're starting to get an idea of this flow, but you also have to build an array, right? This isn't just a single well experiment. This is downhole or surface gauges across a pad. Yeah,
I've actually heard reports I've been checking out of another company that's going to build a similar kind of array because they want to know. And of course, you've been writing about how on the frac hit world that describe what they're doing there and how much they can extract from this.
Yeah, I think in the last year, I've noticed, especially the trend of people starting to use pressure data more actively, write about it. Whereas 2 or 3 years ago, I posed this question to a lot of people. How often do you measure pressure during fracturing treatments? And the answer was, usually we don't, or we do, but we don't look at the data. And now what people are realizing is that there's pressure slopes that can be identified as different events happening in the subsurface. So the complex one is poroelastic responses. This is essentially the rock being squeezed, and you will see that in the neighboring well. Doesn't necessarily mean you've put fluid and sand over into that well, but it could lead up to that. You could break through the rock and actually flood sand in the next well. And so recognizing these signals is what we were talking about a little bit earlier. People now know that they're learning the thresholds of the rock. They're learning how the rock behaves. And as one operator put it to me, he's like, you see this for a few times and you're kind of amazed. You see it 1,000 times and now you know what your rock will do. And so the completion sector is not turning a blind eye anymore to the job and looking at the data in post. Increasingly, people are trying to figure out how can we look at this in real time and automate the process is the next big step. So an engineer is not looking at the pressure data, the computer's looking at the pressure data and telling the engineer what it means.
Right. I mean, ultimately, the reservoir is just these fractures. In a way, this is getting back to the basics of petroleum engineering, which has always been kind of a game of how much information can you extract from pressure, temperature, and flow.
Yeah, and this is really a good topic to lead into the last thing that we wanted to cover today, which is the cube developments, because these systems are these reservoirs are systems, and they work together, and so usually. If you go back and you look at a lot of industry slide decks 5 years ago or even a little bit more, a lot of the projects were talked about as isolated. These wells, these unbounded wells would produce really well. And then as infill drilling took hold over most of the major basins, we saw that the child wells, the next wells were coming in lower. And so this is, of course, a huge, huge topic in the shale sector. We've been covering it from a technical angle for about 3 years. But to get around that, people want to make all child wells or all parent wells. Basically, that's the cube drilling. Drill them all at once and complete them all at once. And that's what the largest operators have started moving towards in the Permian Basin.
Right, and this is obviously a huge, huge test of where the pressure reactions are going, which wells communicate with each other. And one thing they don't want to do is to try to find that out by spending how much money they spend here.
Well, so the cubes, they have a price range that people throw out there. We hear $100 million to $250 million, which is a pretty notable range there. But they're massive projects. I mean, I've seen papers been given on these, and you'll have small independent operators in the room, and they'll get up and raise their hand, and they're saying, well, I don't have enough capital for 6 rigs at once. So what what am I supposed to do? So it really has kind of bifurcated the shale game a little bit. And there's people who can afford to do cubes, and there's people who can't. And so the cube really I tell everybody, don't have tunnel vision on the cube and think that this is the only solution or development pathway. It's only one of several that have started to emerge.
So is there now a poster child for cubes?
Yeah, so the Concho Resources Project came out a couple of months ago. The results showed that this was a 23 well project, and that the production looks like it's falling short of expectations. And so Concho took a year to drill these wells out in Lee County, New Mexico, which has become considered sort of the sweet spot of the Delaware Basin, half of the Permian Basin. And the first few wells came on just fine, right in line with company averages, over 1,000 barrels a day of initial production. Then the last 6 wells of this 23 well pad came on, and they were weak, about 40% lower initial production than the first wells. And what this suggested to the experts and the analysts out there, I think even to Concho, was that the wells may be draining from the same zone, which that suggests that the area may have been overcapitalized. So did they need 23 wells, or did they need 16 wells?
Overcapitalized. In other words, they spent a lot of money in that for no good reason.
Yeah, so this is always a big question with well spacing, right? This isn't just tied to the cube, but the cube really highlights this shale question, which is, am I getting more reserves, or am I accelerating production?
So what was different about those bad wells? Were they the ones that were in between the initials?
Yeah, I don't know the exact orientation, but what we do know is that the wells on average were 230 feet apart, which if you've looked at most company recipes, that's very, very tight, and a lot of companies were doing 200-ish, 250 feet in places like the Eagle Ford a few years ago, and they actually started to back off. Now the Permian players are starting to go through those same kind of learning lessons. So as far as being a bad well, I think what's interesting is that they were turned on, after the first ones popped, and that's what kind of the 40% decline in initial production was an immediate tip off that these wells might be in communication. And if you've been studying that whole area, this is not just frac interference or frac hits, but over time these wells can still produce from each other's zone.
Right.
And the question is, how much co-production is okay, and how much leads to diminishing returns? That is not always very clear, and that's why these projects, this one really hit the company's stock hard, but you can't fault them for trying to push the envelope, because everybody's trying to see how many wells can we squeeze in, and now it looks like 24 wells is too much in this part of the Permian Basin.
Well, on the other side, though, a lot of times in this industry, somebody has a bad experience, and the people generalize and say, that's it, it's a terrible idea, it's dead, never do it again. Do you get that impression that what did this, what did you learn about this that's negative, and what potential is there that this might actually work?
Okay, so the black eye for the shale sector here is that when cube projects were first talked about by the operators, the idea was that maybe you could get up to 60 wells in a 640-acre section. Yeah. Because the Permian, as many people know, is stacked. So you can put these wells, vertically 100 feet apart and squeeze a bunch of these straws in. And to date, a pad that big, the one I just described, that's never been done in the Permian, right? So what people are realizing, some people call this the recalibration of expectations. The cube operation on the surface appears to be necessary going forward to lower the cost of drilling and completing these wells. And if you do that right, you can actually afford to have a lower producing well, because you've achieved some economies of scale on the surface.
That, and you're not moving anything around, and you can just mass produce it.
Yeah, that's right. This is actually the closest thing the shale sector's ever gotten to the so-called factory mode drilling. But the downside is that you don't know if your plan is right. You don't have the ability to do trial and error as much as you do if you're putting your wells in sequentially. So you open up 20 wells at once, and only after a few months of that, do you realize that maybe I put too many wells in?
I mean, another thing is on these things, wasn't it that they believed that if you came in after something was fracked a year or so, that the pressure drop in the old well was going to just be a magnet for frack hits, and that by doing everything at once, you would overcome that. But I guess there's a limit to how much benefit that is.
Yeah, it goes back to the idea of pressure management, right? So the cube essentially is a pressure management tactic. The in situ pressure, the virgin native pressures there, you're going to try to take advantage of that so you don't have these big zones of depletion that, like you said, they call them pressure sinks. All the fracks just want to go that way. So why not do them all at once? Then you had that really high pressure system. And people, talk about frac barriers and even loading up one well to act as a frac barrier for the ones on the right side of it or the left side of it. All of that stuff is happening, but it still doesn't account for the fact that if you use too tight of spacing and your wells are essentially, the easiest way to think of this is I put 2 wells where I should have just put 1.
Right.
And now these 2 wells are producing what 1 would have. That's the problem with cube drilling that the operators are challenged with overcoming. It's also the exact same reason why we're not going to see, at least in the Delaware Basin is the consensus, we're not going to see any 25 well pads or certainly any 50 well pads, because the communication between these wells is higher than what was initially believed 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, you could space them wider, but I guess the problem is when you have that many wells, are you just absolutely guaranteed of hitting some of the marginal rock?
Yeah, that goes beyond my pay grade right there. But this is why people talk about flow units. Oxy's big on that. We wrote about that last year. So if you know the tendencies of how fractures grow in a certain layer, that's when you start to get spacing right. So that's why subsurface diagnostics, that's not necessarily real time, but we're talking about stuff like pyrolysis, which you've written a little bit about. So the geochemistry world, all of that stuff's getting more important to understand how these rocks flow once you frack into them. And that's still, I would say, emerging science. And so it just shows you how complex, getting things right in the shale world is. We see a lot of pictograms of how to put wells into these, these layer cake shale formations, but those are just cartoons, and the reality is so much more complex than anything that we can draw or try to express visually about how these systems work.
At least for reporters, for sure. But I mean, you got to think that if you can drill a well and complete it cheaper, the idea will stick around.
Yeah. So just to sum this up and tie this all together, cube drilling appears to have a future, and I haven't met anybody that thinks that cube drilling is going to go away. What it doesn't answer for, though, again, is how much do you know about the subsurface? How much do you know about proper well spacing? But as an operational tactic, even the most pessimistic analyst on the shale outlook are still get the economies of scale that are provided by cube drilling. So there's no way that cube drilling is going to go away. It's just going to have to focus much more on the subsurface. They're going to have to do what they did on the surface. They're going to have to do that on the subsurface now.
And we can promise you at JPT, we're going to keep writing about it until these guys get it right.
Yep, or till somebody makes us stop. But we think it's, we one of the reasons why we go into these issues so much is that climbing the learning curve in oil and gas is essential to success. And so we bring you these stories, we bring you these topics because we think that some people are learning things and they're giving them out to share. We just want to amplify those learning lessons. So we covered a lot of ground today, Steve, but I think that we're going to have some more topics in the next episode. We're going to probably delve into some different areas. But all the things that we just mentioned, all these stories and articles and reports, they're on JPT Online and in print. These topics have been getting a lot of attention, which is why we're highlighting them over again here. And in the show notes, we're going to put links in there. So we'll have a few SPE paper links papers that we're referencing, and we'll have some links to articles. Hey, let's take a break real quick and look at the SPE event calendar. OTC Brazil will be in Rio de Janeiro, 29th through the 31st of October. Then in November, 7th through 8th, we're going to have the Liquids Rich Basin Conference in Odessa, Texas. And the Asia Pacific Unconventional Resources Technology Conference, the Asia Pacific ERTEC, will make its way to Australia in mid-November. And kicking off 2020 in style will be the International Petroleum Technology Conference, IPTC. This is going to be held in Saudi Arabia from the 13th to the 15th of January. And for a complete list of conferences, symposiums, workshops, and more, please visit spe.org/events/calendar. All right, folks, let's keep the conversation going. Please use the hashtag SPE Podcast on all your social media channels to reach out to us. We want you to leave comments, reviews, give us some ideas. We love hearing from you. You can also find SPE Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. So just search SPE Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, TuneIn, etc. And we're also online at spe.org/podcast. And of course, we want you to read JPT online and in print, so please make sure to bookmark us and check in for new content. I want to give a special thanks to our producer, Jason Notoris. I'm Trent Jacobs.
I'm Steve Rassenfoss.
And see you next time.
SPE Podcast is powered by the Society of Petroleum Engineers, the largest individual member organization serving managers, engineers, scientists, and other professionals worldwide in the upstream segment of the oil and gas industry. Learn more at spe.org.